Project Mercury had now achieved all of its goals, its entire reasons for existing. First, Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom had replicated the man in space part of the achievement. Then, John Glenn had matched Yuri Gagarin and put an American into orbit. So, what was next for Mercury? Honestly, not much. It was time to close out the program and prepare for Project Gemini, though these last 3 flights would not be without their controversies and quirks. Let's go through them one by one. I've learned a lot over the years by making these videos, and today I'd like to extend that opportunity to you. This channel is all about learning new things, so I'm proud to announce that this channel has its very first video sponsor, Brilliant. You guys probably know I'm not an engineer, but I know my way around the basics of rocket science and astrophysics. Do you also want to be an autodidact? Well, with Brilliant, you can be. Brilliant is an app that provides interactive courses on a variety of STEM subjects, from calculus to geometry to quantum mechanics. They focus on interactivity, knowing that the best way to learn is by doing, scaling the problems according to your skill level, and providing plenty of opportunities for helpful hints if you get stuck. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that lets you play with the concept and make sure that you understand it before moving on. Way more effective than sitting through a dull lecture, Brilliant recently launched a ton of new content that's perfect for learners of any level to start, and allows you to gain insight from real datasets. Brilliant has over 50,000 5-star reviews across the iOS App Store and Google Play, and the courses are crafted by award-winning teachers from schools like Caltech, Microsoft, Google, and more. A lot of the same kind of people responsible for the same space science that I talk about. If this has piqued your interest, use my special link at brilliant.org/dkis to get a 30-day free trial and 20% off of Brilliant's annual premium subscription. That's brilliant.org/dkis today. Brilliant. Learn by doing. So, Project Mercury has essentially caught up with the Soviet Vostok program, though the Reds still have a little bit more flight time under their belts. What was the next step for Project Mercury following John Glenn's first orbital flight? Well, do it again. Much like Gus Grissom's suborbital flight followed Alan Shepard's, the next orbital flight was intended to prove that the first time around was not a stroke of luck. Remember that the whole vibe around Mercury was to display NASA as the slow and steady tortoise that wins the race, while the Soviets were charging ahead with reckless abandon. NASA wanted to be seen as making sure that they were doing things safely and properly, while the Soviets were risking lives. Mercury-Atlas 7 was slated to be, essentially, a repeat of Friendship 7. 3 full orbits around the Earth for a new astronaut in a Mercury spacecraft. Which astronaut? Well, that decision was up in the air for a little while. The original plan had been for Deke Slayton to finally fly on what he was going to call Delta 7, but that changed in early 1962, just 2 months before the launch. Way back when he had first applied for the Mercury 7, Slayton was found to have an erratic heart rate during a centrifuge training run and was sent to Brooks Air Force Base for further medical examination. There, he was diagnosed with idiopathic atrial fibrillation, a form of heart arrhythmia. At the time, he was deemed safe to continue flying. However, early in 1962, NASA Administrator James Webb opened an investigation into Slayton's condition. On March 15th, Slayton was medically disqualified for flight, though he was considered open for later Mercury missions if his health improved. Slayton did everything he could, abstaining from alcohol and cigars, exercising more regularly, but to no avail. NASA leadership would later consider his medical status to remain a risk, and he was removed from eligibility to fly any Mercury missions, the only one of the 7 who would never fly. At least not in this program. So, if not Deke, then who? Originally, Slayton's backup for Delta IV had been Wally Schirra. However, because the disqualification happened so close to the launch date, the decision was made to instead give the flight to John Glenn's backup, Scott Carpenter. Leading up to Friendship 7, Carpenter had been training non-stop in case he needed to step in for Glenn, so he was considered the most ready-to-go astronaut at the time. Carpenter quickly renamed the mission Aurora 7, saying it stood for the, quote, open sky and the dawn, symbolizing the dawn of the new space age. Aurora 7 was the first Mercury flight with a special focus on science. Up until now, Mercury had been focused on getting the job done. Human spaceflight was a whole new world, so the point was to make sure it was a doable feat, that the crafts were sturdy, the procedures were effective, and the astronauts were safe. With Aurora 7, they were only on their 4th manned flight, but it was time to expand a little and prove that human spaceflight was not going to be a one-trick pony. Over the course of his 5-hour flight, Carpenter was scheduled to perform the first studies of liquids and weightlessness, do some photography of the Earth from orbit, and attempt to observe a flare that was fired up from the ground. The liquids experiment was rather unique. There isn't a whole lot of room inside the Mercury capsule, so there was a multicolored balloon within which was a glass bottle, and within the bottle was water, all housed within the antenna canister. Weighing only 2 pounds, the balloon was divided into 5 sections: uncolored aluminum, yellow, orange, white, and a phosphorescent coating that would be white during the day and blue in the darkness. It would be suspended from a 100-foot nylon tether from in front of the capsule, allowing Carpenter to observe how the liquid within behaved and how space affected the reflective properties of numerous surfaces. The nylon tether also included a strain gauge that would allow measurements of aerodynamic drag that the balloon was experiencing. Scott Carpenter entered his spacecraft at 4:43 a.m. on May 24, 1962. Like the others, he also had a breakfast of steak, eggs, toast, orange juice, and coffee, and was also subjected to a hydration regimen of water, juice, more coffee, and sweet tea prior to insertion in the spacecraft. After a 3-hour wait, Mercury-Atlas 7 blasted off at 7:45 a.m. Florida time.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
I feel the liftoff. The clock has started. Roger. Loud and clear, guys. Roger, Aurora 7, stand by for the time hack. Roger.
Ascent was nominal, save for a small anomaly regarding a hydraulic switch that registered a loss of pressure. Other instruments verified the pressure to be fine, and the issue was later resolved by insulating the switches, which were close to the extremely cold LOX valves. Despite this, Carpenter reached orbit almost exactly within the intended parameters and began his mission. Carpenter was the first Mercury astronaut to consume solid food during a flight, rather than the paste given to John Glenn. The food was freeze-dried cubes in a plastic bag, and it didn't exactly go well. Possibly crushed prior to launch, the anti-crumbling coating on the cubes failed, resulting in a number of loose crumbs floating around the cabin. Carpenter was worried they would get sucked into intakes or present a possible choking hazard, though neither ended up being an issue. Nevertheless, the crumbs along with a melted candy bar caused Carpenter to decide to not touch the food after the second orbit, settling instead for a sugar capsule. As the sun rose for his final orbit, Carpenter accidentally made a discovery and solved a mystery from the previous flight. His hand bumped against the inside wall of the cabin, and the impact knocked loose a shower of ice particles from the side of the spacecraft. As they glinted against the dawn light, Carpenter realized that these were the fireflies seen by John Glenn. He banged his fist against the wall of the craft a few times, setting loose more particles caused by steam from the life support system condensing between the bulkhead and the heat shield, which would then freeze in the vacuum of space. Aurora 7's science experiments were a bit of a mixed bag. The balloon experiment, for instance, was essentially a failure as the balloon failed to inflate properly. Cooper's attempts at orbital photography were difficult, as thick cloud cover frequently obscured his view of surface features. Likewise, his attempt to view a flare fired up from the ground were also unsuccessful. However, a more passive experiment was successful. The Mercury spacecraft was capable, sturdy, and deemed able to undergo more intensive and lengthier flights. As he prepared for landing, Carpenter was momentarily distracted by the view out of his window, and began the sequence a little late. The spacecraft failed to hold its attitude, and while he tried to figure out what was wrong, he fell behind in his preparations and also accidentally wasted fuel from the manual control system, which he had forgotten to switch off. After activating the retro rockets 3 seconds late, Carpenter was significantly off course when he re-entered the atmosphere. He would end up splashing down 250 miles or 400 kilometers off from his intended landing zone, prompting an hour-long search by the recovery fleet and a series of news reports that speculated as to whether or not he had made it back alive.
The plan to jump the paramedics onto the scene would seem to indicate that there is some concern in Mercury control that communication will not be re-established with the spacecraft.
While he was brought home without any issues, Flight Director Chris Kraft was very frustrated with Carpenter's performance. In NASA's 1989 memoir about Project Mercury, Kraft called the flight the, quote, most successful to date, except for some extra expenditure of fuel. However, in his 2001 memoir, Kraft stated that, quote, "He was completely ignoring our request to check his instruments. I swore an oath that Scott Carpenter would never fly again in space." The chapter of the memoir detailing the flight was even titled "The Man Malfunctioned." Carpenter was sidelined for future missions and, realizing he was no longer wanted as an astronaut, asked for a leave of absence in the next year. During this time, he trained for the Navy's Sea Lab program, which resulted in injuries that would guarantee he would be unable to fly in space again. He formally retired from NASA in 1967 and from the Navy in 1969. Was what happened to Scott Carpenter fair? That's a difficult question to answer and entirely a matter of opinion. Christopher Kraft defended his actions by pointing out Carpenter's virtually flawless training record and stated there was no reason for him to fumble the landing so badly. At the same time, this period at NASA was filled with tensions between the astronauts and the flight controller office, and there were hardware malfunctions at work that hadn't been identified and had contributed greatly to the increased fuel consumption. Either way, NASA was under a lot of pressure to perform, and the botched landing had resulted in a full hour of news reports that an astronaut might have died on the way home from space. They needed to act accordingly, and they did so. To make up for this, mercury-atlas 8 dropped the science goals to focus on endurance and pilot training. Wally Schirra was up to bat, naming his spacecraft Sigma 7 and planning to spend a full 9 hours in orbit. The flight was delayed by 2 weeks due to problems with the Atlas booster, and these problems would end up following the booster all the way to launch. Schirra was woke up to have the first astronaut breakfast to include fish, a bluefin tuna that he had speared himself the previous day. He entered the spacecraft at 4:41 a.m. on October 3, 1962, finding a compartment held a wrapped steak sandwich that had been left for him. Countdown proceeded nominally except for a brief pause to fix a radar tracking station, and launch occurred at 8:15 a.m., producing small issues almost immediately.
5, 4, 3.
I've liftoff, clock has started. Fancy feels real nice.
You pull your gear pins for this flight?
Yeah, I got the pins on my office wall. Altimeter's off the peg.
The booster was rolling very slightly, caused by a misalignment of the main engines, but was kept on track by the vernier engines. Further into ascent, the sustainer engine had lower than expected thrust and was consuming more fuel than it should have been, due to a fuel leak somewhere within the system. Nevertheless, Sigma 7 entered orbit nominally, though slightly higher in altitude than had originally been intended. 3 minutes into the ascent, Deke Slayton cut into the capsule communications. "Are you a turtle today?" he asked. Schirra quickly switched to the onboard voice recorder, not wanting to broadcast the answer publicly. The mission transcript would simply state "correct answer recorded," and it is at this point that I will direct you to my Project Apollo iceberg and even give you the timestamp to figure out just what Deke was talking about there. The orbital portion of the flight was mostly nominal. Over the first orbit, Schirra felt overheated and spent the second orbit adjusting the cooling settings while Mission Control debated on whether or not to bring him home early. However, he did get it sorted out eventually. Later over Australia, he tried to witness a flare being fired from the ground, but just like last time, it was obscured by clouds. He was, however, able to see lightning over Brisbane. On his fourth orbit, he attempted to spot the Echo satellite that should have been passing below him, but he never saw it. After 6 orbits around the Earth, Wally Schirra returned home, his re-entry and landing going much more according to plan than the previous flight. He was recovered only minutes after splashdown, and as scuba divers moved in to help him out of the capsule, he made a request. Let him sit in the capsule and tow it to the carrier before he got out. A whaleboat was sent and he was brought aboard a carrier 40 minutes after landing. He then made sure everyone was out of the way and blew the explosive hatch to let himself out. Once he got out, he showed medical examiners his arm, the bruising from the heavy ejector switch providing further evidence that Gus Grissom had not, in fact, been responsible for the sinking of Liberty Bell 7. At this point, the question of whether or not Project Mercury should continue was up in the air. Schirra's flight was virtually flawless, and the program had completed all of its goals. Mercury had effectively done all it could, and the next real strides in human spaceflight would only begin once Project Gemini, which was already in development, actually started. However, there was one milestone that NASA had yet to meet the Soviets on: flight duration. Every single Vostok flight, excluding Yuri Gagarin's debut mission, lasted for more than a day, so to truly compete, Mercury had to perform a mission that lasted more than a day. Thus, mercury-atlas 9 or Faith 7 was officially greenlit. If it didn't go well, more missions were on the docket, including a 3-day return trip for Alan Shepard, a second for Gus Grissom, and a second for Wally Schirra. Gordon Cooper would be the final Mercury astronaut to fly, and the final astronaut to fly a mission completely solo in the history of spaceflight. The extended mission would have Faith 7 covering a much larger portion of the Earth, and as a result, support infrastructure was beefed up. 28 ships, 171 aircraft, and 18,000 servicemen would be ensuring one man's safety during his flight. The Atlas booster that was used sported several technical improvements, as NASA now had a high degree of confidence in this rocket. It had an enhanced propulsion system that was intended to provide more stable combustion, improved booster actuators, several internal improvements to the turbopumps, and more that led to Convair engineers referring to it as their, quote, best bird yet. Cooper's nickname of Faith 7 referred to the faith he had in both this new booster and in the Mercury spacecraft itself. On the morning of May 14th at 6:36 a.m., Gordon Cooper boarded his spacecraft to find a gift from Alan Shepard. Shepard hadn't had the new urine containment device on his flight, i.e. a diaper, and left Cooper a plunger on the seat with a note that said, "Remove before launch." Cooper, amused, did remove it, and then removed himself when the launch was scrubbed due to problems with both the radar in Bermuda and with the diesel engine that rolled back the rocket gantry. The next day at 8:04 a.m., Faith 7 lifted off successfully.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Roger, have a liftoff and the clock is operating. That's your clock. Take my 7, Faith 7 on the way.
A few very minor anomalies were automatically corrected by the improved booster, and orbital insertion was perfectly nominal. By the third orbit, Cooper began to look at his list of 11 experiments. One of these was to repeat Aurora 7's balloon experiment. However, after several attempts to eject the balloon, it simply wouldn't deploy. As it was attached to the parachute compartment, the cause of the failure would never be revealed, the entire experiment destroyed when the spacecraft landed. Another experiment involved deploying a 6-inch sphere that had been equipped with strobe lights, a test of his ability to track a beacon in orbit. After deployment, Cooper couldn't see it, but did spot it on his fourth orbit, remarking that, "I was with that little rascal all night." At orbit 9, Cooper was go to take a rest. He enjoyed a dinner of powdered roast beef mush and water, and reported that he was not sleepy, and instead took the time to do what he believed was his best orbital photography of the mission, specifically those over the Tibetan Highlands and the Himalayas. On the 17th orbit, he achieved a worldwide first when he transmitted live SSTV footage of himself inside the capsule, though the quality was obviously less than stellar. By the 19th orbit, the spacecraft began to experience a rapid series of technical difficulties. First, a faulty indicator read that the craft was starting to experience 0.05 Gs, though of course it was still in a stable orbit and this was not true. On the next orbit, all attitude readings failed, and on the one after that, a short circuit left the automatic stabilization and control system without power. On orbit 21, John Glenn relayed a revised checklist for retrofire to Cooper, mostly consisting of steps that would now have to be done manually rather than automatically. The deorbit and re-entry process went completely flawlessly, and Faith 7 splashed down only 6 kilometers from the recovery ship, the most accurate landing in the entire program. After getting out of the craft and being examined, it was found that Cooper was mostly healthy, though a little dehydrated and stiff from sitting in the cramped capsule for over a full day. Following this, there was another brief discussion about whether or not Project Mercury should continue with one more flight. The next planned one would last an unprecedented 3 days, with Alan Shepard returning to flight after his first suborbital hop. However, Project Gemini was calling. It had new goals to expand the capabilities of human spaceflight, including spacewalks, 2-man crews, and performing orbital rendezvous and docking. Project Mercury had achieved its goals by doing everything that the Vostok program had done. The Soviets were still winning in terms of pure flight time, but this was a milestone that NASA decided that they could afford to miss. Project Mercury was complete. NASA's first crewed space program was far from perfect. It existed in unprecedented territory and called for new techniques and hardware that had never been seen before. It was a little janky in a lot of ways, employing existing technology instead of wholly inventing new ones. Early capsules were delivered on top of mattresses on simple flatbed trucks. The launch tower was a repurposed oil derrick. Vehicles were weighed using a truck stop scale. Fire suppression water cannons were manually operated. The azimuth of each launch was changed by a person physically going out and moving a ring that the rocket was sitting on. With all of this improvised infrastructure, engineers were trying to account for the unaccountable, conceive of problems that had never been experienced, and keep people safe in unparalleled, extraordinary circumstances. Astronauts and engineers were put in danger constantly. One nearly drowned, another nearly burned up on re-entry, but Mercury came out of it with a completely unscathed legacy. What it is known for today is, despite never beating the Soviets to any punch, matching them on every effort, often very shortly afterwards. It established all the ground rules. Mission Control crafted their rules around Mercury and continue to live by them to this day. The best of the best, and a couple of chimpanzees, were blasted off the Earth riding in cramped tin cans that sat atop repurposed weapons of war to explore space and come home in one piece. There were those who said these days would never come, that man would never fly safely in space, that what the Russians were doing was a gimmick and it would pass. But look at all that stands on the shoulders of Project Mercury. Today, if you're at the right latitude, on many nights you can go outside and watch a light move across the sky. The light of a permanently occupied research laboratory that has been working in space for over 20 years. We can look at the existing and upcoming achievements of the new space age, Starship, Falcon 9, New Glenn, the Artemis program, and eventual boots on Mars, and know that we owe it all to 7 hardened test pilots and the many hard-working, brilliant people who stood behind Project Mercury.